The woman I loved told me she needed time to explore her options. She thought I'd wait forever. But when she finally came back, I had already moved on and I wasn't looking back. If you've ever been left behind by someone who expected you to stay stuck, this story is for you. Make sure to subscribe because this is just the beginning. I still remember the exact moment I realized she'd already made up her mind. We were sitting across from each other at our favorite coffee spot, her sipping something iced with caramel drizzle, me nursing a black coffee I barely tasted. Her words were soft, almost apologetic, like she was doing me a favor. I just need time to figure things out. I feel like I've missed out on so much. I need to explore life. You understand, right? I didn't. Not then. Not really. But I nodded like I did because when you love someone, you want to believe that what they're asking for isn't the beginning of the end. You want to believe that if you're patient, if you wait, they'll come back. That belief nearly broke me. We'd been together for 5 years. Built a life from scratch. Late nights working overtime, saving up for a down payment, dreaming about trips we'd take one day. I thought we were on the same path. Turns out she had quietly taken an exit I never saw coming. At first, I tried to be understanding. She moved out and I let her go without a fight, thinking space was what she needed. Weeks passed. Then months. I told myself she'd reach out soon, that she just needed to get it out of her system. I saw her posts, new friends, late nights, bars, weekend trips with people I'd never met. No mention of me. She looked happy, free. And I was stuck in limbo, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I kept our apartment exactly the same. Her side of the closet untouched. Her mug still by the sink. Every corner of that space whispered her name. But time is a funny thing. It doesn't wait for anyone. And eventually, neither did I. The change didn't happen overnight. It started small. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning, hoping for a message. I began eating out instead of always cooking for two. I started going to the gym again, not to impress anyone, but because I remembered I used to enjoy it. Then one day, a friend invited me to a group hike. Normally, I'd have said no. But I went. And for the first time in a long time, I laughed without forcing it. The wind on my face, the steady rhythm of my boots on the trail, it felt like I was waking up from a long sleep. That was the turning point. I stopped living in the shadow of us and started building me. I found new routines. New interests. I learned to be comfortable with silence, with solitude. I traveled alone. Met people who had never heard of her, who saw me for who I was now, not who I'd been. And somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting. So when she showed up at my door 8 months later, smiling like no time had passed, saying she'd figured things out and was ready to come home, I just stood there, feeling nothing. She looked confused. Hurt, even. You're different, she said. I am. She thought I'd be standing still like a bookmark in the story we started together. But I wasn't a bookmark. I was already writing a new chapter. She stood there, waiting for me to say something. Maybe to invite her in. Maybe to wrap her in my arms like nothing had happened. But the silence between us wasn't the kind that begged to be filled, it was the kind that told the whole story. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, biting her lip the way she used to when she was nervous. I recognized the habit, but it didn't stir anything in me. Not warmth. Not pain. Just observation. A distant memory. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I stepped aside, not out of hope or nostalgia, but because I didn't need to prove anything. She walked in like she'd never left, like this was still her space. But the place had changed. I had changed it. New books on the shelf. A different rug. The walls repainted a color she would have hated. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room for traces of the life we used to have. But she found none. She sat on the edge of the couch like a guest, hands folded in her lap. I made mistakes, she started, voice trembling just enough for me to notice. I thought I needed freedom. I thought the grass might be greener. But it wasn't. None of it meant anything without you. I listened. Not out of hope, not out of curiosity, but out of respect for the version of me that once would have given anything to hear those words. But now? They landed with the weight of an old voicemail, familiar but no longer urgent. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her try to rewind time. You were right there for so long, she continued. And I thought you always would be. I didn't think you'd ever stop loving me. That last sentence hung in the air like a question, but I didn't rush to answer. Because the truth is, I had loved her. Fully. Deeply. The kind of love you build brick by brick through late-night talks and shared dreams. But love isn't a bottomless well. It runs dry when it's not nurtured. And she hadn't just stepped away, she'd turned her back, walked off into a world that didn't include me and assumed I'd stay behind holding the door open. Why now? I asked finally. She looked down at her hands. Because I realized no one knew me like you did. No one made me feel safe like you did. I thought I needed to find myself, but all I found were people who didn't really care. I miss us. You miss what we had, I said. But that version of me doesn't exist anymore. Her eyes filled with tears. But can't we try again? I wanted to feel something. Regret. Anger. Longing. But all I felt was the steady rhythm of peace. I remembered the nights I'd spent staring at the ceiling, wondering where I went wrong. The countless times I replayed our last conversation. The ache of checking my phone and seeing nothing. I remembered how each unanswered call had pushed me further from the man I was with her and closer to the man I was meant to become. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece. Not out of spite, not to prove anything to her, but because I owed it to myself. Because no one was coming to save me. Because the life I had waited to live with her wasn't worth pausing for someone who saw it as a maybe. She stood up, her voice cracking. So that's it? I shrugged gently. That was it a long time ago. You just didn't notice. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. In a way, she was. The man she had known, he might have said yes. He might have held on to hope and called this fate. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had learned to be enough on my own. I had discovered that freedom doesn't mean walking away from love, it means choosing the kind of love that doesn't ask you to shrink. That doesn't walk away when things get complicated. That stays, not out of obligation, but because it chooses you every single day. She walked to the door slowly, like her legs had forgotten how to carry this kind of disappointment. She turned once more, searching my face for something, maybe doubt, maybe longing. But I had none left to give. Take care, I said simply. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No slamming. No drama. Just finality. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again. It felt different this time. Not empty, just quiet. And in that quiet, I felt something powerful, closure. The kind that doesn't need revenge or a second chance. The kind that comes when you realize the version of you they left behind isn't the one they've come back to find. I walked to the window, watching her fade into the street below. Then I turned away, not out of coldness, but because my life wasn't behind that door anymore. It was ahead of me. And this time, I wasn't looking back. The days that followed her visit were quieter than usual, but not in a way that hurt. There was no echo of what-ifs haunting my mind, no mental replays of her standing at the door, asking for something we both knew was gone. Instead, there was clarity. The kind that settles in after a storm, when the air is still heavy but the sky is clear. I didn't tell anyone she had come by, not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't feel like news. It felt like a chapter that had written its final sentence. Life didn't pause for her return, and I didn't let it. Work was still waiting, my friends were still calling, and the new routines I had built for myself continued to anchor me. I hit the gym early, walked more, read in the evenings, and for the first time in a long while, I was present in my own life. I began to see just how much of myself I had dimmed in that relationship. Not because she asked me to, but because I had been so eager to make things work that I stopped checking whether those things were even right for me. I said yes to her plans, her moods, her pace. I gave up little pieces of my identity in the name of compromise. But real love doesn't require you to vanish. It doesn't celebrate your silence. It grows best in honesty and individuality. I started meeting new people, not with the goal of replacing anyone, but to connect. A guy I met at the climbing gym introduced me to a community hiking group. A woman I sat next to at a coffee shop recommended a book that ended up changing the way I looked at ambition and purpose. Life was gently reminding me that there was more out there than the version of happiness I had once clung to. One Saturday morning, I found myself on a trail an hour outside the city, surrounded by strangers who already felt oddly familiar. We shared water, stories, and silence. The sun was warm on my skin, and the view from the top of the ridge made me feel weightless. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't wish I had someone beside me to make it more meaningful. I was enough. I wasn't lonely. I was free. One of the women in the group struck up a conversation on the way down. We talked about music, films, the difference between escaping and exploring. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. That felt good. It felt fresh. Later that evening, I got a message from her. It was really good talking to you. You seem grounded. I smiled when I read that. Grounded. I liked the sound of that. I hadn't always been. In fact, for a long time I'd been floating in the idea of a relationship that only one of us had been truly present in. I had given my all to a person who was only ever halfway in. And it took losing that illusion to find out who I really was. My ex reached out a few more times after that day, small messages, gentle check-ins, as if testing the water. I responded politely but didn't invite conversation. She probably hoped I'd eventually open the door a little wider. But I wasn't interested in half measures anymore. I didn't want nostalgia disguised as love. I didn't want to be someone's fallback plan. I wanted and deserved something whole. One evening I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and the city lights stretching out before me. I thought about all the time I'd spent waiting. Waiting for her to call. Waiting for her to come back. Waiting for her to choose me fully. But the thing about waiting is that it often teaches you more than arrival ever does. Waiting had taught me what I truly valued. It had forced me to face myself, to confront the spaces where I'd let fear take root. Fear of being alone. Fear of starting over. Fear that maybe I wasn't enough on my own. But I was. More than enough. And I had become someone I actually liked. I had become someone who didn't need to chase love, but who could recognize it when it came, not by the way it clings, but by the way it supports. That night, I deleted the old photos. Not out of bitterness, but because they no longer held power over me. They were just pixels, snapshots of a version of my life that no longer needed to be preserved. The memories remained, sure, but they had shifted. They weren't anchors anymore. They were stones on the shore of a river I had already crossed. And on the other side, the landscape looked nothing like I expected, but everything like what I needed. Weeks turned into months, and life kept moving, as it always does. The difference now was that I moved with it, no longer dragging the weight of an unfinished story behind me. I had become fully immersed in the rhythm of my own life. Work felt more purposeful. Friendships deepened. I found myself saying yes more often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity. New hobbies, weekend getaways, even the occasional spontaneous decision that once would have made me nervous. I was finally living on my own terms. One evening, while walking home from a local jazz bar, I passed by a little bookstore I had never noticed before. It was late, but the lights were still on. I stepped inside, drawn by the quiet hum of music and the scent of old pages. The woman behind the counter gave me a warm smile and nodded toward the poetry section. I browsed for a while, eventually finding a worn copy of a collection I had loved years ago. I bought it without thinking twice. That night, sitting on my couch with the book open in my hands, I came across a line I'd forgotten: sometimes we don't lose people, they lose us. It hit me with quiet force. Not because I was still mourning, but because I understood it now. She hadn't just walked away from our relationship, she had walked away from a version of me that was willing to stay small, to keep waiting, to keep hoping for someone else's approval to validate my worth. But that version of me no longer existed. She had lost something she would never be able to get back, not because I was punishing her, but because I had grown beyond the space where she left me. And that kind of growth isn't something you can reverse. A few weeks later, I got a wedding invitation from an old mutual friend. I knew she'd be there. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid to see her, but because I didn't want the past creeping into a day meant for celebration. But something inside me felt calm. Steady. I went. The ceremony was beautiful, intimate, filled with laughter and heartfelt vows. And then, during the reception, I saw her. Across the room, in a pale blue dress, standing among a small group of people. She looked older, not in a bad way, just in a way that life tends to do to all of us. When her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition, of memory. She smiled politely and I nodded in return. No words. No tension. Just two people who once believed they were forever, now strangers with shared memories. Later that evening, as I stood outside with a drink in my hand and the night breeze brushing past, she approached me. You look good, she said softly. Thanks, I replied. So do you. There was a pause. The kind of pause filled with everything that doesn't need to be said. I've thought about you a lot, she admitted. I'm glad, I said. Not out of arrogance, but because I meant it. I hoped she had thought about me. I hoped she had realized what it meant to walk away from something real, something rooted. You seem happy, she added. I am. She looked away for a moment, then back at me. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if? No, I interrupted gently. I don't. It wasn't harsh. Just honest. Because the truth is, wondering would mean holding space for something that no longer belonged. I didn't want to reopen a door I had locked with care and patience. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening just enough to reveal the emotion she was holding back. I'm really sorry, she whispered. I know, I said. And I did. I knew she was sorry. But I also knew that sorry wasn't a bridge back to the person I had become. She reached out as if to touch my arm, then stopped herself. Take care of yourself, she said, her voice shaking. I always do now, I answered. And with that, she turned and walked back inside. I stayed there a little longer, breathing in the cool air, watching the stars blink faintly in the sky above. I felt no ache. No lingering sadness. Just peace. That moment wasn't about closure, it was about confirmation. I had made it through the fire and come out not only whole, but better. Stronger. More grounded in who I was and what I deserved. In the weeks after the wedding, life continued to expand. I kept meeting new people. I kept challenging myself, pushing my comfort zone, saying yes to the unknown. I started writing again, not just journaling, but really writing. Stories, ideas, bits of dialogue that once came to me in dreams but now showed up in quiet moments with ease. I realized I had spent so much time waiting for someone else to choose me, I had forgotten what it felt like to choose myself. Now, I chose myself every single day. I no longer chased validation. I no longer feared solitude. I no longer measured my worth through the lens of someone else's uncertainty. I was enough. And in being enough, I had created space for the kind of love that would never ask me to be less. The kind of love that grows in truth, in mutual respect, in full presence. And maybe one day it would find me again. Or maybe it already had within myself. Either way, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living. Fully. Freely. Finally.